We're going to turn in our Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 4, and we're not going to get very far tonight. But I've called it a legacy to celebrate. A legacy to celebrate. And I guess the question that asked when I was looking at just these first few verses, they're used many, many times in funerals. But what do you and I want to be remembered for when we leave this earth? What do we want people to think about us? What do we want people to say about us? Well, that's helpful. You don't want people to say anything. I've often marveled at why people wait until someone dies before they tell you all the good things. Because the person who's dead is not going to hear them. It makes more sense to tell them while they're alive, isn't it? But as a pastor, one of my responsibilities is that I usually conduct funerals. And in conducting funerals, I want to find out a little bit about the person who's died, so that I can think about who they were, what they've done, what they've achieved, and bring those points out. And it's not always easy because sometimes you're just asked to do a funeral and you're not given any information whatsoever. In those cases, it makes it hard. But it's interesting how people will tell the stories about the person who's died, what they did, what they didn't do, what sort of a person they were. And in these few verses, we have the Apostle Paul looking back at his life, looking at the past, the present, and the future. And one thing I found is somebody has made these comments. Legacy is about living and life. It's about learning from the past, it's living in the present, and it's building for the future. The idea of legacy may remind us of death, but it's not about death. Being reminded of death is a good thing because death informs life. It gives you a perspective on what's important. But legacy is really about life and living. It helps us to decide the kind of life we want to live and the kind of world we want to live in. Now, when we start thinking about legacies, no matter what our age or state of health, we take stock. We take stock of our possessions, of our accomplishments and disappointments. We take stock of what we've learned from what we've done in the past, what we're doing now, and what we still hope to do. With varying levels of awareness, individuals are also inevitably reflect on the people, the work, the ideas, the commitments, and social institutions that have given their lives shape and meaning. And today, we're going to travel with Paul as he passes the baton or the legacy on to Timothy. And I've called this first one, if we get it right, a settled confidence. He says in verse 6, "For I'm already being poured out as an offering, and the time for me to depart is at hand." Now, as I've said, Paul is looking at life from three different perspectives. He's looking at the present, he looks at the past, and he looks at the future. And right now in verse 6, he's looking at the present. He's looking at his life from the present day. And he knows his life is coming to an end. And what he says is, you know what? I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. I'm leaving this world. Now, I've heard many people saying, "Oh, Lord, take me now. I've had enough." But Paul is saying, I'm ready to go. I know that my time is coming short. And he's telling Timothy, "Timothy, I'm leaving this world. And I want you not to give up, not to quit. It's time for you, my son in the faith, to step up to the plate. I want you to get your priorities worked out. I want you to face whatever comes your way. I want you to complete your ministry because, Timothy, now is the time for me to leave. So, Timothy, I'm passing the baton on to you. You are my successor. It's in your hands. Do the best you can and stay faithful to the one who has called you. Now, I find it's interesting when a person is facing death, they have an understanding, they have an inkling that the time is almost upon them to go. It's as though they sense it. They know it's coming quickly, and so they prepare themselves to face it. And Paul knew and sensed that his time was at hand. And he's saying, now I'm leaving. I'm in the process of being poured out as a drink offering. Now that's a funny statement. I've been poured out as a drink offering. What does that actually mean? And we need to go to understand, and I'm not putting it up, but I want you to look at it. The drink offering you'll find in Numbers chapter 15. This gives us an understanding about the background of a drink offering. There is a new generation who will go into the promised land. And they find it's hard to have much hope for the promised land. It's hard to have, well, if you like, a vision when you've been roaming around the desert endlessly for 40 years. You've been doing it day in and day out for 40 years. Well, what's your hope? You're going to do the same thing tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And so God begins to put hope in their hearts. He gives them some sacrificial laws which they'll engage in when they come into the land. He is setting their hearts upon the possession of the land. He's causing them to think about how it will be when they come into the land which God has given them. In verse 1, it says, Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, say to them, When you enter the land where you are to live, which I'm giving you, then make a special offering by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering, or a sacrifice to fulfill a special vow, or a freewill offering, or in your appointed times to make a soothing aroma to the Lord from the herd or from the flock. God is saying, when you get into the land, I want you to make some special offerings. And he gives some very general descriptions about those offerings. Burnt offering, sacrifice of various kinds under a special vow, freewill offerings in an appointed offering season, making soothing aroma to the Lord. You will then be called upon to give these offerings to God when you come into the land. He then goes on to detail some of those elements of the offerings. In verse 4, And the one who presents his offering shall present to the Lord a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil. Does anyone know how much that is? A hin of oil? If you're an American, it's a gallon. If you're an Australian, it's 4.5 litres. Just to give you an idea of the measurements. 4.5 litres. Now, this is the picture. In verse 4, you present an offering. That would be an animal. It could be a lamb, could be whatever. And then you also give a meal offering of an ephah of fine flour mixed with a quart of oil. It makes a kind of porridge, only with an oil base. Then he says you present wine for the drink offering, 1/4 of a hin with the burnt offering or the sacrifice of each lamb. So you give a lamb as a burnt offering, which means it's all consumed on the altar. None of it was taken by the priest. It was all laid on the altar and presented as a complete sacrifice to God. What it showed was the complete dedication, the complete commitment, the total sacrifice. So when you gave a meal offering, then you gave a drink offering which was poured out all over the first two-part offering. Now, it goes on to say that when the animal gets bigger, and they do bulls and all sorts of things. Well, guess what? The drink offering gets bigger too. So the bigger the offering, the more that this wine offering was to build as well. And you'll find that as you read through. With oxen, with rams, each of the male lambs, and the goats. And the same happened to all the aliens as well. Now, this is the basic instructions that God gave concerning this drink offering. You gave an animal, you gave a meal offering, and then finally, you poured out a drink offering. And the drink offering was the final act of the sacrifice. It too was given in total. None of it was consumed by the priests. It was all poured out on the altar. Every burnt offering was totally given to the sacrificial act, as the meal and the wine were to follow. And that was to happen for everyone, whether you're an Israelite, whether you're an alien, for all times by God's people. And what Paul is saying here, I believe, has in mind what's been spoken in Numbers 15. He says, I am already being poured out as a drink offering. I have already presented, I've already given myself as a living sacrifice to the service of God. I've done that already. And now I've reached a point in my life, right now, where I have nothing more to give him. I have nothing more left. This is it for me. This is the final thing I must do to complete my sacrifice. My whole life has been about sacrifice and service for the Lord. And I'm willing to go all the way to offer my life as a sacrifice through death, as long as it pleases the Lord. So he's reached the point in life, he has nothing more to give. He's spent. He knows his time has come. And at that time, who was the emperor? He was a wonderful guy. You know, he warmed the cockles of your heart. And he did. He burnt you alive. And that was the Emperor Nero. And Nero made no bones about his dislike of Christians. He persecuted them brutally and severely. And Paul is a casualty. He's sitting in a prison cell. He's waiting for the final sentence. And he knows his death is about to take place. His blood would be poured out as a symbolic, like drink offering. His personal sacrifice that he could make. And he says, you know what? The time of my departure has come. He knows it may be short. It may be an hour. It may be 5 hours. It might be a few days. It might be a couple of months. But he knows it's not long for him to go. Now, people don't like speaking about death. It's just a subject you avoid. But Paul looks at death as not being the end. He looks at it as something not to be feared. He calls it a departure. Now, not many people look at death as a departure, but really that's what it is. You're departing this life for another one. It's a departure. And he's leaving this life for a new one. And he uses a word for departure, aneulysis. And as one commentator shares, there are 4 word pictures that describe this departure. And I've put them down because I want us to understand that death is not something for us as a Christian to fear. And the first idea of this image, in image 1, is unyoking an animal. That's the use of this word, or one of the uses of this word. It's taking an oxen, it's taking a bullock who was hooked up to a cart to pull a plough every day. And what it's saying is, this is the time, this aneulysis, if you like, was where the yoke was taken off the oxen. And Paul looks at it, hey, I'm being unyoked. I'm being released. He sees it as a release from his toil He sees it as a rest from the labor that he's been done. In other words, it's a wonderful picture that he presents of death. He says he'll be glad, finally, to lay his burden down. The toil has been burdensome. Often it's been difficult. Often it's been very wearing and debilitating. So he looks now at the end of his life, and he looks at death as a release of that yoke. He's taking the plough off his back. He's unhooking the cart. He's laying his burden down. And you know what? He's free. And that's the idea of what death is. I'm free from the labours, from the worries of this world and everything I did in it. The second image of this word is the breaking of the chains. It means to loosen the bonds on a prisoner. Now, Paul knew what it was like to be chained as a prisoner. He was in more times chained to soldiers and places than anybody else. But he looks at death as a liberation, as a freedom, no longer chained. He would not only lose the physical chains, which he had so many times, but you know what else it means? He would loose the chains and the bondage of his own flesh, of that sin that dwelt in him. He would be free from the appetites of the body, of that nature. No longer would he have to struggle with it. There was no conflict anymore. He's released. He's free. He would exchange the confines, if you like, of a prison for the freedom of the courts of heaven. That's a picture of death. Then, this one we know from Scripture, the pulling down of a tent. Now, Paul knew what it was like to be a tent maker. He'd probably put up tents that many times in his life. He knew how to build them, so he knew how to take them down. And this word is used for taking down a tent. You know, Paul lived not in a house so many times, but as a nomad. He moved from place to place, town to town. So he understood what it's like in his 30 years of ministry and education. He knew what it was like to live in a tent. He knew what it was like to strike camp again. In other words, pull his tent down. And what he's saying here, I'm taking down my tent for the last time. I'm never going to put it up again. I'm taking my tent down for the last time, and I'm going to go on the greatest journey that I've ever known. I'll never need a place to sleep again. I'll never need a place to rest from weariness, because the road that I'm going is taking me to the house of God. And what he's saying is, I've pulled down my tent and I'm ready to go where God is. That's a beautiful picture of death. Nothing to be feared. But this same word, there's another word picture that captures it as well. The releasing of a ship from a dock. It's a word that's used for letting the ropes. When a big ship comes in, you tie it up at the docks, and you've often seen these big ropes that tie them and hold it in so that it can't get away. And what Paul has as this picture is of a ship where you undo the ropes and the ship is able to sail out into the harbour. It's free from being restrained. And, you know, this is what he says. I am sailing to another harbour. I've been let free from this. So they're beautiful pictures of death. And for me as a Christian, that gives me some wonderful encouragement not to fear death. And Paul, as he's facing death, is not, oh, woe is me. What's going to happen? He sees the release. He sees the freedom. He knows where he's going. And that's the assurance. Every believer should know and have that assurance that death is not the end of everything. It's the beginning. It's being in the presence of God. It's being let loose. It's being free. And one day every person here You're going to pull your tent down, the body in which you live. That's what Peter calls it. The tent in which I live for the last time is going to be pulled down. Every one of us will face that unless the Lord comes. He's going to the harbour called heaven. And so death for him is a departure. He's just waiting to go. He can't wait any longer. He's anticipating it. The yoke comes off, he's free. The chains are broken, he's free. The tent is taken down, he's free. The ship is released from the dock, he is free to go to the shores of heaven. Death is laying aside the shackles to be free. It's striking camp to take up residence in a heavenly palace. Death is setting sail, casting off the ropes of this world to end up in the presence of God. And Paul says, I'm already pouring out my life as a drink offering in a final act of self-sacrifice. That's how he viewed the present. His life is close at hand. His departure is ready. And you know what? He's ready to go. Now, I wonder tonight, as Christians, are we ready to go at any time? As we look at our lives, are we still shackled by this world? Are we still shackled to the things of this world that we don't want to let them go? Paul had no such fear. Paul saw death as a release for something that was better to come. And as Christians, we shouldn't fear death. We should rejoice and look forward to the freedom and also the life that is to come. And I'll leave it there because we've reached our time in that. But that first picture that has been given to us, this is the legacy that Paul looks at his life at present. And you know what? He has no regrets about anything he's done, as we'll find out. But he sees the sacrifice, he sees the commitment, and he's ready to go. I wonder if the Lord was calling us tonight, how many of us would be in the same frame of mind? I'm ready to go. I'm ready to go. My time is at hand. You know what? I'm looking forward to leaving this earth behind and what is to come. It's the final promise, the fulfillment of everything that he has done for the Lord. He's looking forward to it. Do we look forward to it? You know, we say that when we're older. But when we're younger, we got a bucket list and we got everything that we want to tick off. But you know, Paul says, I'm ready. Or I'm ready to depart. And some of you, in the next few weeks, are going to depart and leave the Northern Territory and go to places like Victoria, places like Sydney and Western Australia. You're going to depart. And I would like to think that you're anticipating a wonderful departure. There might be a build-up before it happens, but when it happens, I'm finally on my way. And that's what death is, finally on our way. So as we close, we're going to stand as we sing